I think a lot of the growth comes from the other people. And so to
Mm.
me, I just kind of try to keep learning and just keep seeing what everyone else is doing. My name is Steve Cuevas. I roast for Black Oak Coffee Roasters in Ukiah, California. We're in Mendocino County, and I've been roasting for about 9 years or so.
How did you find your way into coffee?
Um, so the story always starts with there's a coffee shop out in San Leandro, and I ended up finding these group of punk rock people, and I lived at the house, and they all worked at the coffee shop, so we all just ended up working at Zocalo Coffee House. And at a certain point, one of the people who is now the owner started learning to roast, and I would just sit by as I watched them learn to roast, and they just did everything. Everything was written down on paper, and they all did it by sight and smell. And so that was like my introduction to coffee and to roasting. But I didn't really pay attention to it until way later. At that point, I was just a barista, and tasting espresso back in the day was kind of like 20. It was something like 21 grams in with about 10 to 16 grams out, or a half an ounce of like an ounce of volume, but it had no weight. So it was kind of like the worst espresso I've ever had.
Wow.
So I went on a journey behind the owner's back of like trying to learn how to make better espresso and pulling longer shots. And so I started just, doubling the weight of the shot. And so
Mhm.
that's how I just kind of got into coffee. And then I just kind of never fully left. I just kind of kept going back and forth.
Mhm. Um, you compete, a lot. I think you also competed at last year's competition as well. Um,
Yes.
uh, what drives you to compete? Like, what do you like most about competition?
There's like, I feel like there's a few different factors, and some of them I feel are like wholesome, and while other ones are kind of more ego driven. Like to me, I think it's just, I love traveling. So a lot of times when I talk to people, I always play down the whether I did good or bad. And I normally talk up about I'm only here to see my friends again, and I'm only here to eat food that's local to the area. And so those are my two favorite things that I do. But so I get to travel with that. But in reality, sometimes to myself, I really think about I love bringing some of these awards to a town that nobody ever like doesn't even know exists. And so I like the idea of having people look at Ukiah in particular and be like, oh wow, I didn't know there was coffee there that was award winning.
Um, you don't just compete in roasters. I see your name and I see you at events. You compete in multiple competitions. Like, how does one do that? Because I mean, it's difficult competing just in roasters alone. But like I think you qualified in Denver for cup tasters as well.
Yeah,
I-
yes. Um, you know, to me it was kind of like honestly there was some pins that the SCA was selling that were like cool, the cool little logos that you see like on the website. And so it's the little roaster pin and then the brewer's pin. And I was just like, all right, I want to collect them all, but I
oh,
don't just want to buy them. So I was like, the only way I would feel comfortable is competing in the competition and then buying the pin. And so I've bought in all the pins except for the Barista one, which is, I feel like that one is way out of my league. I'm sure at one point I'll just send it and just phone it in, just because a lot of times, if anyone talks to me about like how I prepare for things, I don't. Um, I should, I think, about, I've succeeded without having to prepare too much. Um, but yeah, I think I've competed in brewers, cup tasters, roasters, and SIGs.
that's very impressive. And I'm assuming you just went to qualifiers and you didn't do the prelim route this year.
I signed up for the prelim,
Yeah.
but what happened was that my coworker, she's our newest roaster.
Mm.
She didn't make it in time to actually sign up, so I was able to convince them to switch over my entry to
Um,
hers. because my thought on it was, it was the same thing where I'm like, well, I'm going to be competing at the qualifiers, so why do I need to take up a space? So it wasn't necessary. But then there was so much anxiety over how the spaces were actually allocated. And so there was, at a moment, I didn't actually have a spot for the competition, and there was a wait list. And so I was kind of freaking out because I've been competing since, I think, 2017, I believe. 2017 is when I won, but I think that was the first year I competed. So I kind of felt like this, I felt this loss, for not being, to me, I want to kind of be known more as a roaster as opposed to a cup taster. So I was kind of like a little saddened by not being able to get that slot, but they opened up a wait list, and I literally sat there with one page on the atomic clock and the other page just hitting refresh as soon as that time came.
Wow.
And then it was even more anxiety because they actually didn't refresh it on their end until like 5-8 minutes later. And so I'm just, I stopped roasting and just kind of trying to get that wait list, and I got on there. So
I'm glad everything worked out. That's a really, that's a really cool story, seeing your journey. Because I was actually going to talk about like how did you, your path to Portland. But it sounds, it sounds very interesting in terms of having to give up your spot and also just waiting to get into qualifiers.
Yeah.
Are you? Oh, go ahead.
I was going to say, like, so when I competed in 2017, I had a cup taster slot. And my boss was really bummed out because he didn't actually get in. And so I was just like, you know what? You can have my spot. And I gave him my cup taster spot. And when we landed in, I think it was Seattle. When we landed in Seattle, they were like, I asked somebody, I was like, do you guys still have spots? They're like, yeah, we do. You can purchase one if you'd like. So I also gave up my 2017 cup taster spot, which ended up being the first year that so that was the year I won the US Cup Tasters Championship. So it was kind of those, a lot of times when I just kind of have no preconceived notion of that I need to do well, I end up doing well. So yeah.
Well, definitely shows, your skill set and how quickly you can adapt. So, you mentioned earlier about prelims, your coworker. Do you also coach, or are you planning on coaching when you are done competing, or is that something you're already doing now?
I try to help anyone and everyone I can. Whether what I do is called coaching, I have no idea. I kind of encourage, and if they have a question, I'll field it, and I try to help out as much as I can. I know. To me, always trying to get new people to do the competitions is kind of like, I'm trying to get people excited to be at a coffee shop as opposed to being like an employee and just kind of seeing that there's a career. You don't necessarily see that when you only work at the coffee shop, and we're so out from community. Like if I want to go see coffee community, that might mean 2 hours to San Francisco. If we get lucky and there's some sort of coffee event, it might be like an hour and a half to Sacramento, or about an hour to Santa Rosa. So coffee community is not something they see a lot. So trying to get them to, trying to trick them by being like, hey, like the company might pay for you to fly out to a bunch of different places, and, until they actually fly out, they don't actually see what that community is. And so to me, I got two of our new head of barista training and our production manager to compete in the cup tasters. And so they had an awesome experience with going to Denver and going to like the after parties and stuff like that. And, like for me, I hit the ground running, and like, I don't go to the Airbnb. I literally just, as soon as I wake up, I stay out. And so I kind of have that mentality for them too, where we're like, I'm going to this after party, meet me here. And so it was really awesome to try to connect them to the people that I know, just so they can get inspired, like, so some of like the people that I look up to, it was kind of really awesome to try to connect them, Alexandria Littlejohn, and like, I think, like, it was just, for me, it was just like a bunch of people I can be like, look, this person's here. You don't know who they are yet, but you will.
That's great. Knowing, I think I first met you like real briefly at Guild Retreat. I think that was in like 2017.
Yeah.
Was that when it was in Lake Lanier? And
Yes.
yeah. And then seeing you compete, and fast forward to this year, about to compete in another roasting competition. How have you grown as a roaster?
I feel like I always tell people, like, competition is about going out there and making your mistakes and learning to fix your mistakes. My biggest mistake has always been the portion where there's the speech, and that's always been my shortcomings. Like, I would say if I was to grow, I think I would hit up coaches and ask for training on how to do this. And but for some weird reason, I just don't. I don't know why I don't. Like, this competition, I went there knowing I needed to write a speech, but I didn't take any line paper. So the day of, we bought some fried chicken the night before or something like that, and so we had a to-go bag. So I literally ripped the to-go bag apart and started writing on the to-go bag. And the Airbnb had like a folder, so I used the folder to hide the paper so the judges couldn't see the paper that was like a brown piece of paper that was torn and ripped up to shreds. And so I'm sitting there writing it the day of, and I think I worked on it for about like 4 hours before I gave the actual speech. And I didn't score so hot, but I ended up getting third. But the only goal for me was to move on. So I don't overstress about the qualifiers, because the only goal of the qualifiers is to move on to the next round. And so I felt like I've accomplished it. But I know where my shortcomings are, and I haven't fully addressed them at the moment. As far as roasting, I feel like our cupping table has we've added the two people. So Nana, our head of education, and Tracy, our production manager, they're now constantly on the cupping table. And they're also, because they want to do cuppings, we've done more practice cupping than we've done in a good little while. And so I think having more opinions, having more people say what they think they're tasting has been helpful, just because the real part of the roasting comes in the cupping, not the actual act of roasting. And so I think hearing more about what the roast tastes like has been more important in the growth. And so when I took the coffee, when I roasted this coffee for competition, I really value their opinion. So I really made sure that they tasted it, and really had to we didn't have that much coffee. So I really had to, hear what they had to say and which coffee we enjoyed before we took.
Speaking of qualifiers, did you cup the coffee at all once you landed or got to Denver, or everything was cupped prior to leaving California?
We cupped it before leaving California, but I literally just cupped it maybe twice.
Yeah.
I think I cupped it once, and I was like, okay, I have an idea about it. And then I picked out all the Quakers, and I picked out any coffee that looked super light. And it gave me like a reference point. And so the coffee with the Quakers had this nice softness, but the coffee that had everything that was lightly colored, like if you did like if you sorted by color, I was left with something sour and thin. So I knew that I had to only pick the Quakers out and leave anything else that was lightly colored. So that's what I ended up doing. And I knew it would work out, because I've done that with in espresso competitions, where I picked out a natural Ethiopia super clean, and it just ends up being thin and sour. So I went the route of just picking Quakers out, leaving it very minimal, and cupping it when I got to Denver, which was its own like unique thing, because water towers that set at 194, 196 or something like that.
Mm.
And so water boils at 202. We're used to boiling the water in the kettles. So we keep it at a little bit like, there's a little rolling boil when you take them off the kettles. And so we were just dropping them into like kettles and then pouring straight in. So, I sit there and think about like, oh, is there heat loss from the transfer of the kettle? And then you put that into the bowl, we're at elevation, so I didn't overthink it. I did have those ideas, but I didn't think too much about it, just because there's certain things you can't control, right? Don't worry about the things you can't control. I think the other question I had too was, I asked the committee whether they were doing a TDS on the coffees, because if the extraction, like normally we TDS coffee to 1.3. When we do our cupping, we try to hit 1.3. So we know that we're in that cupping range of like, it's pulling out the right body, and whether it's the flavor or not, that's a different story. But, we TDS our cuppings, just to make sure. And they weren't fully sure. They weren't planning on doing it. So it was just kind of like, I was just asking. And so I got an answer, and I was just like, well, nothing you can do about it.
Yeah. Last question, what are you most, you have a bunch of competition experience. What are you most excited about going into Portland next month?
Honestly, like, again, like I feel like food and friends, like those are my only two. Those are like those two things that stand out. Like for example, somebody knew I was heading out there, and they're like, "Oh, go to Pak Pak." And like, if you've been out there, you know what Pak Pak is. It's just like this Asian restaurant that has like the best wings. But I was like, I had to look it up, because I was like, oh, maybe he knows something that I don't. And I was like, oh, they've been closed for a while, so it got my hopes up. And so I'm just kind of like, but I think seeing friends and stuff like that. I try not to have any preconceived notions on how I'll do. I think at the competition, everyone was asking me like, how do you think you did? And my reply was like, that's up to the judges to tell me how I did, not like to think about it, right? Because the way that I explained it to them is like, you're at this level of how you feel, and if you're like excited that you're gonna win, you got to travel even further to your like that you didn't. So the depression is like bigger. So if you stay neutral and you lose, you don't move that much. But if you're excited, and so I just try not to think about how I do. I just, I go out there, I do what I do, and then I wait nervously for the announcements. I feel like that's one of my favorite things about cup tasters, is that like at the end of that, you know where you're at.
Yeah. Pretty immediate.
There's always like a level of downplaying things, just because I don't want to like, anytime anyone says like, oh, you're very skillful, I just kind of downplay it. But there is a lot of time that gets spent on doing things. And like my previous competitions, I used to do the sample roasting and all the roasting after work. And so I'd be here till like midnight sorting coffee and stuff like that. And I know some of us actually fly out, and I know I went to Arkansas last year for the competition, so I can play with the stronghold. And so I got to talk to Dakota from Onyx and like talk to a couple different people. And then I know the owner of Broadsheet, when we went out to Boston, I was able to play on the machine out there. And so there is levels of like preparing and getting ready. But I don't normally think about it, so sometimes it goes like with not being said. But I think I think right now too is like, it's nice seeing Huckleberry and Kiara and Shelby and all them do well, and kind of like the growth of competition goes with the person who does well. You look at. And so to me, like, that was kind of something that I can look at. I spent some time in San Diego, and I got to go to Monstera's Coffee, who won last year's U.S. championship. So I think a lot of the growth comes from the other people. And so to me, I just kind of try to keep learning and just keep seeing what everyone else is doing.
Yeah, couldn't agree more. And, you always competing and, being there at the national level. just shows, your approach to things and success too. When you won Cup Tasters, and that's a cool story, by the way. I had no idea.
Yeah.
That's what happened back in Seattle.
Yeah.
So, yeah. Well, thanks so much for the time, Steve. Looking forward to, seeing you compete again next month. And yeah, try not to bother you too much during the competition, but hope we can talk story a little bit.
Yeah, absolutely. I appreciate it. Thank you.
Right on. Thank you.